Battle between democracy and autocracy.
I think we have a major challenge, say, with autocracies, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But we have a far deeper problem within the West itself. Our major problem is internally, not between civilizations, but within our civilization.
You were in China, in Nanjing, in 1949, at the time of revolution.
My two brothers died. There was no food, no medicine. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. And we made our way out, and there were 10 million refugees on the road. And Mao may have killed up to 50, some say 75 million of his own fellow Chinese. In other words, more people are being killed under atheist regime than all the religious oppressions probably in human history.
That experience there with the communist revolution, any lessons for this moment right now that we're facing in the West?
Never be naive. Their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and their promises never are fulfilled.
Hello, I am in North Greenwich at the ARC conference, and I have the pleasure today of speaking with a historian, a critic, and a philosopher, and author of over 30 books, including the Magna Carta of Humanity. It is Os Guinness. Os, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me.
So you had a panel with Jordan Peterson, and some of the stuff you said really punched, but your life is pretty remarkable, and you mentioned that you were in China, in Nanjing, in 1949, at the time of revolution. Now, you must have been incredibly young, so I don't know if you have any memories or whether your family relayed memories of that period, but what was that?
Well, both. I was 7 when the revolution broke out, and I'll never forget the day, January 49, when my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek's abandoned the city, and we're at the mercy of the Red Army." And in they came. And the town was festooned with loudspeakers. Mm-hmm. There were trials in the morning and public executions in the afternoon. And you'd meet friends you knew well in the streets. They'd look right by you as if they never knew you, because it wasn't worth their life to admit that they knew you. They'd be in prison immediately or worse.
Huh.
So I saw that. I was there 2 years under the reign of terror. My dad was tried publicly, trumped up charges, all collapsed.
Really? So hang on a sec. Was he, obviously he's not Chinese or not?
No. My parents were medical missionaries.
Ah, okay. And so they come out there, they brought you and...
No, I was born there.
You were born there. Okay.
And we were stuck there. There were some of the last 12 Westerners in China. But after 2 years, they were allowed to entrust me to a friend who was coming through. And I came back to England and went to school here.
Uh-huh. So your parents stayed out there?
Well, they had no choice. They were under arrest.
What?
So they stayed another 2 years.
Why were they allowed to stay, and why were they under arrest?
All Westerners were suspect.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And so they hadn't done anything wrong at all. But in fact, earlier, my mother was a surgeon. Chinese venerated medicine and almost considered surgeons something magical and supernatural. So earlier, and this I've only heard through accounts of my parents, we were in a north-central city of China. There was a terrible famine. 5 million died in 3 months.
Before 49?
Before the revolution.
Wow.
And we had the Japanese army on one side who killed 17 million, communist army on the other side, and the nationalist army on the third side. And as I said, this terrible famine, my 2 brothers died. There was no food, no medicine. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. And we made our way out, and there were 10 million refugees on the road. Wow. So I grew up in incredible circumstances the first 10 years. But the point for me, though, later on in life, it gave me an incredible realism about the face of Marxism. And I'll never be naive. And I was intrigued because many years later, when I was a graduate student at Oxford, my tutor was at All Souls. And I'd go to dinner there, and the highlight was Sir Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher. And the first dinner we were there, it turned out he was talking about my background. He'd been a 7-year-old in the Russian Revolution. And I was a 7-year-old in the Chinese Revolution, the two major communist revolutions of the 20th century. And we both witnessed incredible violence.
And Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous biography of Karl Marx. And I think if I'm not mistaken. And so he, like you, were never mistaken of the reality of Marxism, I imagine.
No, absolutely. And totalitarianism in general. And what moves me now, I'm in my 80s now. He would say I was in my late 20s then.
Mm-hmm.
He would say, thank goodness the English-speaking people stood against totalitarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
But imagine his shock and horror as a Jew at all we've seen recently, and particularly the inroads of cultural Marxism into the West. In other words, the West stood against classical Marxism, Stalin, so on, stood against Hitler, and now has capitulated in so many ways to cultural Marxism.
Well, look, I want to ask about that, and there's much to discuss, but you said so many interesting things just there. Like, I want to ask, what was Isaiah Berlin like? And as a person, not to mention his ideas, but I also want to go even further back. But maybe, what was Isaiah like?
Truly a rich, wonderful person with a deep, wonderful voice. And it was such an incredible experience of life and the people he'd met. One of those people it's what a privilege to spend a dinner with them. So it was an enormous privilege. And you had cabinet ministers and head of the MI5 and all sorts of people at All Souls, but he was always the highlight.
Really, yeah. Okay. And so, sorry to rewind again, and because you've said so many interesting things, but you said earlier you were never mistaken about what Marxism meant. That might not be clear to everyone, and that seems to be the case with its reemergence and popularity over the last 10 years, and maybe it's taken a different shape, let's say cultural Marxism, as you have mentioned. But when you say you've never been mistaken, what is it that you've never been mistaken about?
Well, I saw what the revolution did, the Reign of Terror, and Mao may have killed up to 50, some say 75 million of his own fellow Chinese. In other words, more people have been killed under atheist regimes in the 20th century than all the religious oppressions probably in human history.
Do you think
people haven't taken that into account?
Do you think that atheism is a crucial part of that? Why would you qualify it as atheist?
Well, very crucial, because, for example, you take our postmodern ideas in the West today. If truth is dead, the only operating principle is power. And so you take something like the radical left today and their views of injustice. They analyze discourse. How do people speak? And you're looking for who's the majority, who's the minority, who's the oppressor, who's the victim. Find your victim and weaponize them. But the way they want to do is to set up a conflict of powers. But if you think, no truth, only power, the only possible vision of peace at the end of the line is of a power so powerful it can put down every other power. And that's what the Romans called the peace of despotism. And that's why the radical left has always led to authoritarianism. So I put it bluntly, their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and the futures they promise, the withered state and all that sort of stuff, never arrive.
So
we've got to be realistic about it.
Why is it then that it remains so popular? Why does it never...
Well, what we're facing in Britain and in the West, I'm currently living in America, although as a European, is not classical Marxism, communism, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. That's obvious, Stalin and all that. Mao, we faced it. What we're facing is cultural Marxism. And many people are unaware of where cultural Marxism comes from. Antonio Gramsci back in the 20s and the Frankfurt School and so on.
Yeah. And Marcuse and that seems to be slowly those names are being articulated, and people are pointing to where the seeds of this sort of came from.
I happened to go to the U.S. for my first visit as a tourist in 1968, Well, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated. They had at the Democratic Convention the so-called police riots. But it was a year 100 American cities were ablaze. But here's the point. The radicals knew they wouldn't win in the streets. Far worse riots than 2020. They wouldn't win in the streets. So they called for a long march through the institutions, Mao style. In other words, they said, if we incrementally win the colleges and universities, and then the press and the media, and then what they called culture industry, Hollywood, entertainment, then you sweep round and win the whole culture. Now, we're 50 years on. They've done it.
See, do you think, so, is this a point of decline that, we've seen Rome fell, but then it moved to Constantinople, and some would say then on to Russia. Are we at a point where the West, it's kind of a repeat, but there are options, obviously you can't say the future, but what, are you worried that this is like, we're facing a decline here, or do you think it can be salvaged?
We're facing a possible decline, no question. But there's a big difference between a civilization based on Judaism, the Christian faith, from the previous ones. If you look at the ancient civilizations, there's a high sense of fate, necessity. You think of Oedipus Rex, the oracle speaks. He tries to overcome what the oracle said, and everything he does actually makes it turn out all the more. Fate. Can't escape it. Kismet. Karma. What do you think of our modern atheist friends? Marx, Freud, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. To a person, they're all determinists. You look at Sam Harris's book on freedom, you have a puppet dangling on strings. We are not free. Freedom is an illusion. The great difference in the Jewish and Christian faiths, God, who is free, made people in his image who are free. I don't mean totally free. But just as we're free to go wrong, we're free when we go wrong to face up to it and turn around. So you have the notion of repentance and renewal and restoration. And that's the big difference. So you take the Jews, they transgressed and were in exile. And then, as Moses and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and other great Hebrew prophets said, they were restored. And you can see that down through history, the power of awakening. So I'm not a pessimist.
Okay.
There can be renewal. Will there be? That's God's to say. I don't know. We just got to do our part here.
Well, okay, so there's a question of God there. You mentioned God there at the end, but also you listed those atheists like Harris Dawkins. And we've also talked about civilizations like Maoist China, like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, where they killed God. And it was all hell broke loose. In a society like where we're at, where secularism grows, where to be Christian now in Britain is technically a minority, and the atheist movement is still widespread. There seems to be some sort of pushback against it, but can we restore without God? Can a civilization exist without God as its foundation?
No, we got to make the choice. I said earlier, maybe I didn't. I've been in so many things today.
Yeah.
I forgot what I said where. We've got to choose. So if you take just a matter of faith by itself, apart from civilization, you've got three major families of faiths, as the philosophers put it. The Eastern family, Hinduism, Buddhism, the New Age movements. Everything goes back to an impersonal ground of being. Then you've got the secularist families of faiths, atheists, materialists, naturalists, physicalists. Everything goes back to chance plus time plus energy and matter. And then you've got the Abrahamic, and the two ones in the West, Judaism and the Christian faith, you go back to a transcendent personal God. Now, the answers flow out entirely differently depending on which one you choose. So clearly, if we choose the atheist one, you can see which way. Eventually, with the atheist one, put it simply, you end up with a state as God, one Thomas Hobbes calls the mortal God.
Do you think that, as Samuel Huntington described, that we'd face a clash of civilizations, And there's seems that went away for a bit as an idea, but again with the Russia-Ukraine, although that maybe is sort of intra-civilizational rather than inter-civilizational, but now again with, as we described, the Islamic world, I guess, against the Judeo-Christian West, we're all sons and daughters of Abraham, of course, but those are drastically different civilizations. Do you agree with Huntington's idea that we're going to be
broadly?
Yeah.
But in the mobility of the modern world, the civilizations are much more mixed up than the old lines. The old lines are much clearer. So the main challenge in the West is not external.
Uh-huh.
I think we have a major challenge, say, with China and the autocracies, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But we have a far deeper problem within the West itself, the ideological war of the West, or what Douglas Murray calls the war on the West.
Mm-hmm.
So our major problem is internally, not between civilizations, but within our civilization, calling the very idea of civilization into question.
Quite. That seems to be that anti-West. In fact, that's what Neil Ferguson wrote about in his book Civilization.
That's right.
It's going to be within civilizations that we have that problem, and there seems to be a very a happy marriage from within, but from the outside, the anti-Western beliefs that are anti-Western held by Westerners mixing with these anti-Western beliefs held by new immigrants to the West, which become very, very potent. And we've seen it on the streets, and we've seen them lining up and down Whitehall, doing prayer. It feels like a kind of a service, like their church sort of thing. It's very drastic to see. Is that something that you're affected by?
Oh, absolutely. The American Republic, to take an example, has to have a unity. And they used to have the motto, a pluribus unum, out of many, one. So you could have immigrations from Ireland or China or Mexico or Italy or wherever it came from, so long as you taught them to be American. But that's broken down. So that unum, the unity, no longer taught in the public schools. And then they have an open border. So what citizenship? America is literally, as a republic, committing suicide.
It's even harder, I think, in Britain. And because in America, it's kind of, you could say, what are American values? And you can sort of point to the Constitution, and it's based on Christian values. And it's harder to answer the question, what are British values? What do you think the unity is?
In Britain? It's hard to say. People mumble about things like fairness and so on. But, I've yet to hear a British leader articulate what is the unity in a highly multicultural society, which means you'll inevitably go in the tribal, balkanized direction, which is disastrous.
Well, that's the question I'm asking, because how are we supposed to work on assimilating new people to our country, which, I'm not against immigration, but how can we work on assimilation if even British people can't, in a sentence or a paragraph, say what it is to be British?
No, I'm agreeing with you totally.
Yeah.
That's where we've got to challenge people to articulate, and that's what that school in Wembley and so on is obviously trying to do with great success. In other words, we believe in the richness of diversity. So immigration, people from all over the world bring their gifts from all over the world, so long as they're integrated properly. They become British, or they become American, or become French, or whatever it is. But when you see the banlieue in Paris and so on, where the immigrants have zero desire to become French. No, that's incredibly dangerous. Or the no-go areas earlier on in this country, that's incredibly dangerous. But it was political thinkers who allowed them in that uncritical way. And that we're paying for the folly of the past. And we've got to start articulating what is the unity. Now, then you have to have both the young in education brought up to know what that unity is, and then every new arrival in the country has to be inculcated into it too, so people know what it is to be British.
But what is it to be British?
You tell me. You live here now. You tell me.
Do you have an insight from the outside? Sometimes it's if you spend time away from it, you can. It's easier to identify what is, the idiosyncrasies or the uniqueness.
It's an odd thing, though. I mean, I do a lot of commentary on various things. The hardest place is one's own country.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'm particularly out of touch recently because I've been in America 30 years now.
Yeah.
It's relative. Well, what you remember Kipling's great line, what knows he of England who only England knows? So there's certain things you see very clearly when you come from abroad, and I see incredibly clearly in America, which Americans don't realize.
So what is it for America then?
Well, for America, I mean, St. Augustine says, how do you understand a nation? You don't look at the size of its army or the strength of its population or whatever, throw weight of its missiles in modern terms. You look at what a nation loves supremely. And there's no doubt what Americans loved supremely over all the years, freedom. And it's a very distinctive type of freedom, which actually comes from the Torah. And many Americans don't realize, the 17th century was called the biblical century. Not because they were holy or anything like that, but because the politicians were fascinated with the Hebrew Republic. Even Thomas Hobbes, an atheist, has far more about the Bible and politics than he does about the classics. What's the biblical politics? Covenantal. And there are three features of biblical covenantal politics which shaped English Revolution and the American Revolution. Of course, it failed here and succeeded there. But the first one was the consent of the governed. It's a very simple notion, freedom, consent of the governed. But 3 times in Exodus, God puts out his covenant, and it says, all that the Lord says, we will do. So as the rabbis put it, even when the master of the universe proposes something, it's only a covenant agreed when the people sign on. That's the origin of the consent of the governed. The Exodus is the master narrative of human freedom. It's no accident that let my people go, is said by everyone who wants a revolution.
So that's one of them. What were the other two? So consent of the governed.
Well, the second one, a covenant, is a matter of a morally binding pledge, not a law, not a contract. A law is narrower. If you and I have a contract, we bind ourselves at some narrow place, but you're not bound to me in life. Maybe to your wife if you're married. That's different. That's a covenant. It's a morally binding pledge. And so there's a trust because people are challenged to keep their promise. The third element is the reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. You're all in the covenant together. So the rabbi says there wasn't one covenant, there was 600,000, because there were 600,000 men. And another rabbi said, no, that's wrong. There was 600,000 times 600,000. I can't even work that out. Because every Jew was making a covenant with every other Jew as well as with the Lord. And you think of the 3 Musketeers, all for one, one for all. Now, that was the 17th century, but the Jewish notion was love your neighbor as yourself. It was a solidarity. So they have a maxim, every Jew for every Jew. That's covenantal.
That's almost, for me, that answers my earlier question about what Western values are. It's, in a sense, those 3.
Absolutely.
That's
but you know that those are biblical. They're not classical Roman and hierarchical. So you've got to make constantly choices and know which one you're choosing.
Okay. And so you think the Americans have understood that better than...
Originally,
yeah,
they've abandoned it. They haven't a clue. I always remind Americans, you say, what is the most famous saying about democracy in America? Lincoln. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Terrific. Americans don't know. He was quoting. He was quoting a pastor several months earlier. The pastor was quoting John Wycliffe of Oxford in the 14th century. And Wycliffe is saying, if we take the Bible out of the hands of the clergy, and you remember only the clergy had the Bible in those days because they were elitist, and give it to ordinary people, as Tyndale says, so the plowboy can read it, then you'll make possible self-government, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, because they'll have the foundational basis in their lives for living freely.
And that is actually the crux about freedom. You mentioned earlier, if you to whittle down what Americanism down to a word, it's freedom, but that freedom is anchored and moored by the fact, by their faith, by their belief in a God, and that keeps them contained somewhat. to act as you've described by those different covenants to their neighbors.
Yeah.
And so again, I'm sorry to bring it back, and I'm hammering a point, but if God is dying, what does it mean? And we're heading towards freedom. Is that?
Oh, freedom's at stake.
What, sorry?
At stake.
At stake, yeah.
I mean, you just begin with the fact, apart from the Bible, where do you ground freedom? You cannot ground it in secularism.
Well, Sam Harris has tried to do that, and he did that in the moral.
No. Sam Harris is the one who says freedom's an illusion.
Oh, okay.
You had a Stanford scientist recently saying freedom, simply I've studied it for 50 years, is not there.
Okay,
now, if you look for freedom only on the basis of the scientific method, you can't find it, because that looks back. And their hope as determinists is that you discover all the forces that shape us. At the end of the day, we cannot do otherwise than we did. We're determined. That's not freedom. The Bible gives you the grounds of freedom. But not only that, it gives you the way of being free. And so you know Lord Acton's famous saying, freedom is not the permission to do what you want. It's the power to do what you ought. And there's a great paradox of freedom. I challenge Americans. Freedom is the greatest enemy of freedom. Because unless you understand it rightly, it undermines itself.
Do you think that in Europe there's a different conception of freedom to America?
We've never been... the French, equality rather than liberty. So we've had different ways of it, and we haven't had freedom as the central thing the way the Americans have. Now, I would say that we British, though, the English Revolution was extraordinary. It failed.
The Glorious Revolution?
No. The English Revolution, 1642.
Oh, okay. After,
again, what happened? It was a chaos of ideas. I mean, the Digger maxim, freedom is the man who turns the world upside down. They had actually a biblical view, a view of revolution based on the Bible. Very simple. God creates order. Humans create disorder. So God works in a disordered world to turn it the right way up, and that's revolution. So revolution is turning the world upside down, turning it the right way up. And you have in the book of Acts, the agitators attack the Apostle Paul. These men who've turned the world upside down have now come here.
Okay.
You can see that's actually the biblical view of revolution. Now, there are a lot of weird ideas, too, in the English Revolution, and it was the lost cause, and of course, the king came back. And what was the lost cause here became the winning cause, the other side. But they've forgotten their own roots today.
And is it, where in America do you live?
I live in Washington, D.C.
And so you're right, the center of where the thinkers are is do you think amongst those people leading that country, those guys have an idea of, have they lost it as well? Have they lost conception, or is it?
Most of them had. You have people here at this conference who really would understand everything I've just said and much more, but the average politician wouldn't have a clue.
So what do we do about it?
One of my central calls when I talk in Congress or to the Senate or senators is we need a Lincoln. What Lincoln did was, leaders define reality with a vision. Lincoln addressed the evil of the day, slavery, in the light of what he called the better angel of the American nature, with a profound conviction in the Declaration of Independence. But he called for a choice. You can't stay half slave, half free. House divided, he quoted Jesus, house divided cannot stand. And we need leaders, America needs a leader like that. You can't be half 1776 and half 1789. Ideas from the American Revolution, ideas from the French Revolution. They're polar opposites.
I mean, whether it's a leader or not, the problem is that America really is divided, where there's just completely different conception of what the country is.
Absolutely.
And so...
But what's the division, Winston?
But yeah, well, that's right. What would this Abraham Lincoln? What's the thing that ties it together that would create the synthesis of those two parts? Would reunite them?
We have to ask what's the division. Some say social media, some say it's pro and con Trump, Some say it's the coastals, California, against the heartlanders in the Midwest and the South, and so on. I think the deepest division is between those who understand America from the perspective ideas from the American Revolution and those who understand it from the ideas coming down from the French Revolution, because postmodernism, multiculturalism, the sexual revolution, the cancel culture, go on down the line. Every one of those ideas comes down from the heirs of the French Revolution, not the American. So you take the Hebrew prophets, Elijah stands up. You can't follow Baal and God. You can't sit on the fence. You've got to choose one or the other. And that's where Lincoln did the same thing. You can't be half slave, half free. You've got to go one way or the other. And I think America's got to say, which revolution do you want? I also think Britain, now, the trouble is there's no clear British unity or ideal. That's the trouble. So the inroads are deeper and there's no counterweight. But people have got to say, do you realize Britain has a great record on freedom. We brought in things like freedom of conscience and human rights and so on. They're all going.
Absolutely.
And we got to say, some political leaders got to stand up. Do you realize where these ideas come from? Do you realize where these ideas lead to? You must choose, because the consequences are strong.
And instead, we are told again and again that diversity is our strength, when actually it's unity despite our diversity, which is our strength.
Yeah, or diversity with unity.
Exactly.
Which turns it into richness.
Exactly. We need it. We're
not afraid of diversity. I'm a follower of Jesus. You look at creation, the flowers, the animals. This creation is incredibly diverse, and humans are the most diverse of all. Diversity is wonderful if you have the balancing unity.
Exactly. But no one seems to be articulating that. We've created God out of diversity.
Yeah.
For the sake
but
of
since it's in the interests of our humanity and human flourishing to do it, I hope the younger generation will rise to address that. No, we want them to see through the dangers of Marxism. I happened to have as it were, a 7-year-old, 9-year-old tutorial as a boy. I will never be taken in by Marxism. And I remember, visiting countries like the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary and so on when they were under the Soviets. No one who's lived under communism can be naive. But I often say, if you look at Europe, the East is the West and the West is the non-West, by which I mean Eastern Europe has lived under communism, is not naive. And that's why you have realists in Poland and Hungary and so on.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of Western Europe has been free for so long, doesn't realize where freedom comes from or the dangers that are coming in.
What do you think, just to tie us all back together, going back to what you learned in China, does that specifically have, that experience there with the communist revolution, have any lessons for this moment right now that we're facing in the West?
Well, for me personally, it gave me the sense you've got to have, whatever your worldview is, your faith, your philosophy, it's got to be realistic. The 20th century produced, the Holocaust and so on. You've got to have a faith that can look evil in the white of the eye and know you're still confident in ultimate reality and the goodness and so on. That, for me, was one lesson. The practical lesson in Marxism, I would never be naive. And you heard me say at the conference, I say it repeatedly, their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and their promises never are fulfilled. And we've got to be realistic. And people, certainly in the US and over here too, naive.
On that note, Os Guinness, an honor to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Great privilege. Thanks for having me, Winston.